Hey guys, as many of you know, I did the little video with Dave McMurdo thing, and I've been getting a lot of messages about us talking about the topic of violence, and so I wanted to broach on that subject a little bit more. Um, I want to be clear that my stance on and specifically in self-defense. I mean, I don't condone violence in any way. You can't. I'm not talking about going out and murdering people. I'm not talking about living a lifestyle of fighting with people or anything. I'm talking about specific instances where um, I would just say when you or yourself or someone in your family or even a stranger, someone's life was in danger. And I just wanted to address the what I think are the obvious problems maybe with the complete pacifist nonviolent view. Um, I'm not completely settled on this. It's still something I'm trying to wrestle with, but there is some, I think, some obvious points. Especially living down here in the South, I think there are some things that just don't hold up. So first, I guess I want to look at kind of the biblical angle and see what the deal was. I think in the Old Testament, it is clear that self-defense was completely justified. I don't think anyone can argue that. Uh, and you look at some people will say thou shalt not kill, and they trust me on this one. The correct understanding there is thou shalt not basically murder. And if you believe that, then you got a problem, because when Moses came down off the mountain, what did he do? He killed over 3,000 people. So that's a bad understanding. We have Exodus 22, 2 and 3. If a thief be found breaking into your home and he is smitten and he dies, there's no blood guilt on him. If the sun rises on him, there is. Um, the one that's interesting to me is First Timothy 5:8. But if any provide not for his own, especially those of his own house, he hath denied his faith and is worth than a infidel. That's in the King James. I think it says non-believer in the ESV. So you know how to take that statement, providing for one's own. Does that mean protection? And then you have a more interesting thing when you take a look at Romans 13, and that would be, I'm sorry, Romans 13:4. It says, starting at 3, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger, who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. And then he goes on to saying, paying taxes. So he seems to be justifying that the king can use violence against you. And if Paul was a pacifist, I don't think that this passage would be here. To be quite honest with you, he would have no business condoning anyone's use of violence, but he clearly states that the king is God's avenger and he will bear his sword. And what does that mean? It means he's going to use violence to do something to you. So I don't think that's taking Paul's words out of context. And what's funny, he goes down into verse 8 and then he starts saying, "Yeah, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet." Or, any other commandment summed up in this word, you shall love your neighbor as you love yourself. Love does not wrong a neighbor, therefore love is fulfilling the law. So he goes on to say all this stuff about loving your neighbor, but then he's also telling you that the king will commit violence against you, whether he's your neighbor or not, because you have to follow certain edicts from him. So it's kind of funny. It's almost like there's a law prescribed to you to pay taxes and all this stuff, and you have to obey it according to Paul. And violence is on the table. And he calls him a servant of God. So read 13, 3 through 8 very carefully. But we do have approval of violence by Paul from the king as a servant of God. And I think that's indisputable. I don't think that fact can be argued. But what I want to get at more, like I said, is kind of the concepts of this. You know, you have Exodus 22. If a man steal an ox or a sheep or kill it or sell it, he restoreth 5 ox. You know, so there's like a blood debt one can get himself into. I'm not even gonna read all these. There's a bunch of them, but there's many cases like in Nehemiah where they are told to pick up swords and defend themselves. Like I said, Peter had a sword, and when he used it, that seemed to be the problem, was when he used it and what he used it for. You know, he told him once before, "Get behind me, Satan." He was doing his mission with the Father, and Peter was interfering yet again because he didn't believe properly what Jesus was going to do. But he tells him to put his sword in its place. He doesn't tell him to throw his sword away. He doesn't tell him anything like that. And it was common that, you know, he sends them out with the sword. The sword that they bought back then was for one thing. It was for protection against bandits and animals. That is it. Now, Jesus did not change any of the laws, period. And I think that's important. You know, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That was not a law. That was a creed of vengeance. It was a creed of making someone pay, getting even with someone. So getting even with someone, to me, does not have anything to do with self-defense. So the eye for an eye passage, to me, doesn't say anything. And the other one, turn the other cheek. What's odd about that is he speaks about the right cheek. And to be slapped in the face in Judaism was an insult. And theoretically, to be slapped on the right side of the face would only come from the back of a hand. So, you know, that to me, and even Jesus was slapped in the face and he didn't technically turn his cheek. So there's something else going on there. So, but that's to me, that would be the first point. First and foremost, self-defense in the Old Testament is taught crystal clear. And Jesus does not change any of those laws, nor does he say you can't defend yourself. He never says anything like that. And if he did, then he'd be changing the laws. Now, as we look into it further, it seems to me in the New Testament, self-defense is it's a given. It's already implied. It's already a natural law, if you will, that has been there since the Old Testament. Um, you know, and like I said, laying down one life for the gospel is one thing, and living down here, man, I'm just telling you, there's a lot of what I think are fairy tale examples. There, you know, that would be my question. Number one, how do you you know, the weakness of some of the non-violence people, you know, does this apply to animals? Number one, you know, is violence against animals okay, who also have the same spirit that man does? And, you know, they did clearly carry swords in the New Testament to defend against animals. But if you believe that you can't commit violence against animals, then you can't eat meat at all. Because meat only comes from one place. It comes from someone killing something else. Life is always taken from other life. So you'd have to be a vegetarian, to me, number one. This is to be a true pacifist, to me. You know, like, I think Gandhi was a vegetarian. You know, the true pacifist, I don't think would harm any living creature. You know, and you could debate whether a plant was, I mean, the plant is a living creature and it does emit signals they have found and hormones when it is in distress. So even it knows it's being harmed. But a non-vegetarian pacifist, what you're telling me is you're okay with violence against animals, you know. Um, okay, so that strikes me as a little bit odd, because you're not a complete pacifist. You believe in harming God's creation in one respect, I guess, would be how I see that. Then to go on further, like I said, the perfect example is something that happens a lot. People get kidnapped every day. I don't know the exact statistics, but children are taken every day. And like I said, I kind of would expect people who don't have children to have a different view on this. And, you know, you just see the world differently when you have children. You have a different tendency towards protection. and it seems to be the natural order of things. Why did God make the man naturally bigger and stronger and faster? And it's because he deals with physical threats. It's always been that way in the Bible text anyway. The man was the guard of the house. But as we see in First Timothy, excuse me, in Romans, there's no way around that text. He's bearing sword. If you think that means anything other than executing violence against people for not obeying the king, and he's saying it's perfectly justified. So there is a clear-cut example in the New Testament where violence is perfectly justified by Paul. And you have the fact then when Jesus comes, it's going to be through violence. He too is going to destroy the people who deserve to be destroyed, if you believe Revelation in the text. So violence is all throughout the Bible, and it just seems to be it's almost treated as a fact of life, I guess I would say. The question is, what side of the fence do you come down on if you do commit violence against someone? But that to me, yeah, that is a question for me. When Paul's talking about cowards, I mean, what kind of person is he talking about? Is he talking about somebody who would watch evil done to someone else? Is that a coward to Paul? I don't know. I don't know exactly. And getting back to, like I said, like the kidnapping situation, whether it's your child or someone else's, and like I said, if you don't have children, you just don't have the same set of priorities and emotions that someone that does have children has. And it's kind of hard to listen to someone who doesn't have children really condemn people on this topic. It's almost like the Pharisee thing. I live my life a very specific way, and my low efficiency apartment somewhere, and I don't have no kids, and this is the way it's got to be. And it's just not how human beings operate. It's not how we were given our our natural biological emotions and inclinations to protect our own kind. Those are there from God too. They're innately in us. But my theoretical situation is simple. And a lot of people, what they do is they really just don't answer it. They just kind of say, well, no, I would rather see someone just address the question and the premises in the question. So you walk outside, you see someone who clearly you know the child belongs to someone else, and you see it's a little girl, 6 years old maybe, and you see two 40-year-old men, one covering her mouth and dragging her off, the other one opening the van. You clearly realize this is a kidnapping situation, whether it's your child or not. My question is, what do you do? That to me is the question. What is the godly thing to do? Do you just scream at them and tell them to stop while they just take the kid and drive away? We all know what's going to happen to if it's a girl. We pretty much know what's going to happen. She'll probably be raped and killed at some point. Probably. We know something bad's going to happen. Two, do you try to stand between the child and the van, and therefore they just smash you in the face? Maybe they run off. The mere fact you just walk up to them, they freak out. But let's say they're more like the criminals we have down here in the South. Anybody that reads the murder statistics in New Orleans, they have no problem doing things like this. And so you get between them, dude punches you in the face, maybe he stabs you or whatever, and your intention from the beginning was to never do anything, physically, and they knock you down and they take the kid anyway, or they just blow your brains out and then they turn around 2 weeks later and find the kid dead too. So two people died, and for what? And it wasn't for the gospel. Did you die in a godly manner? Like I said, anyone who steps into a violent situation and does something, I have a certain type of respect for. I understand that everyone's a fighter, if you will, if you want to look at it that way. Or do you physically intervene? Do you touch them? And at that moment, you violate your own principle. Violence is exerting one's physical will against another, and that's what you've done. So do you get into a wrestling match with them? You decide you're not going to hit them or anything. you're just going to kind of tussle with them, which, technically is violence, but I guess I could respect you're still trying to adhere to your nonviolence teaching. Um, in which case, being that there's two of them, you probably will lose eventually. They will take the child. But, four, do you straight up hit the guy? Okay, well, then you violated your own teaching. Five, do you shoot the dude? You violate your own teaching. And then, we get into the bigger issue. You can't call the police to me. I'm going to be honest with you. You cannot call the police to me if you're a pacifist, because you know what they're going to do if they show up. They're only going to do one thing. They're going to commit violence against those men. So, using someone else to do your violence to me it's really despicable. If you're going to have this view that no one can be physically, assaulted in any way under any circumstance, I think it's, there can't be police in your world. There can't be any law and any order, because they would violate that teaching. In the world to come, I don't think these things will be issues, but we're talking about the world right now. So those are kind of the things that I wrestle with this, is that Paul openly condones violence in Romans, in Timothy. What is he saying there? Providing for those in your house. Is protection part of that? And I would say it absolutely is. It's a natural right of all animals and humans to defend themselves. It's in the order. And there would be no violence in the perfect world. I agree. And like I said, I'm not a violent person. It's not like I go outside and pick fights with people all day. But as it stands right now, I do believe that there is grounds for violent intervention in situations. And it's not an unchristian thing. Like I said, dying for the gospel, going out and preaching as evangelists, and like I said, things that would happen to me, I wouldn't even care so much. But to watch someone else be harmed and know I could do something about it, what you're saying is that the situation in the Good Samaritan situation, you wouldn't do anything if you showed up 10 minutes earlier. You'd watch the guy get beaten and robbed and possibly killed in that era. And I don't think that's the what is the difference if you walk by and don't help someone who's beaten up and bleeding, then you walk by and don't help someone who is getting beat up and stabbed and robbed and beaten. I don't see that as a godly behavior. I don't, and they always like to default to these, and I do call them imaginary situations where, you know, well, God will provide a way, he didn't, you don't see that. You don't see that's what's happening in general. You don't. And I'm not saying God can't, very carefully discern that statement. But you look down here, man, we had a guy a year ago trying to save a woman who was being carjacked. He got his face blown off right in front of his kid. And what if the guy was an atheist? You know what I mean? It just, it's pointless. It's pointless. I don't see how God gets the glory just for some guy getting his face blown off, and now his kid is raised without a dad. He was just trying to help this woman, and where did God provide a way for him? Let's be honest about this for a second. Look at the more famous news case of the guy that they ran over with the car in Britain, the Muslims, and they tried to chop his head off. No one helped him. No one even bothered to help him. They stood there like a bunch of cowards. And that's how I feel about that situation. It really is. I could not stand there and I like this, I would like to think I couldn't stand there and watch someone decapitate another human being in the middle of the street. It's is that what Paul was talking about when there's 50 people standing around and not one of them would raise a finger to help this man that they just ran over with a car? Is that a coward? I don't know. And trust me, I got a brother who is very, very pacifist, and I'm not a violent person, like I said. But when you look at all the ramifications of this teaching, you can't whip your children anymore. No whippings are allowed. I don't think you can really harm animals at all. Even if a bear came into your house and was mauling your children, I don't know if you could necessarily do anything about it, because that's violence against another being that knows it feels pain. It just seems to me that if you take that kind of thinking to its outcome, It's not sustainable. You know, there's no military now. And I do believe countries have a right to protect themselves. You know, they do. And like I said, there'd be no law, there'd be no police because you couldn't enforce any law. There'd be no kings. And all throughout the Bible, we see Jesus sent Peter to Jerome. Jerome was a centurion, and centurions did one thing. They fought and killed people. That was their job. They beat people. They did all this stuff. You know, I have every reason to believe Jerome engaged in violence in his day. And then you have Paul buddying up with these kings, Agrippa and all this. All these people who exercised, authority. And what did kings do? They fought with their enemies. They punished their enemies. They punished bad citizens to them. So why is Paul hanging around these people? Because he didn't tell them they were wrong. As a matter, like I said, if you go to Romans, you actually see what he's telling you. They're perfectly justified, and not only are they justified, they're a servant of God. And if you're going to take bearing the sword against you in any other way than violence, then you're really all fooling yourself, in my opinion. I think the simple fact of the matter is that self-defense is a given throughout the entire scripture. That's what I think. And then, yeah, when a man goes out on his own and he's preaching the gospel, and there's a difference to me to dying for the gospel, dying, spreading the gospel, and that statement, laying down one's life. That means to me that's kind of suggesting you get involved in a situation where you're trying to protect someone, and protecting people is almost always going to come through violence. I'm sorry, and that's viewed as laying down your life. You get killed trying to protect someone from someone else. And if you chose not to engage in violence and got killed, I still would think you were a Christian. I think you would be carrying out your conscience as best you could. So I'm not definitely not judging someone who wouldn't. But I guess the point is, I don't think you should be judging people who do believe in self-defense. I don't think there's a biblical basis for it. Jesus' disciples, they had swords. That's just the fact of the matter, is that they had them. And in Peter's scenario, like I said, you're talking almost 3 years. 3 years he carried a sword around. For what reason? I'm going to tell you for what reason. It was for personal protection against robbers and animals. The same reason they all carried swords. And then you have the one in, you look at Luke, in the prophecy there. Yeah, it is more of a prophetic thing, I understand. But he told them to buy a sword. I mean, people don't think about that, you know what I mean? That just strikes me as very odd. And he also sent them out by twos with the one sword, if I'm not mistaken. For that reason. How come there was any swords allowed, period? It's mind-boggling. Imagine those were guns, because it's basically what they were for their day. You had Peter walking around openly brandishing a gun, openly. While Jesus is preaching, he's standing there with a gun. And that tells me something, that tells me between the lines. One, Jesus did not come to change the law. And he said, until heaven and earth pass away. So the law of self-defense will be here until heaven and earth pass away. Because I believe evil will be here until those two things pass away and a new creation is upon us. So, yeah, self-defense is a law condoned by God in the Torah, and it stretches out indefinitely because Jesus came not to change the law. So let's be clear about that. You can't biblically condemn someone who defends their family. I do believe in that fact. I don't think there's a case for it biblically to condemn someone. The passages, like I said, of eye for an eye, turn the other cheek, those are all related to vengeance type situations. It's a supreme insult to be slapped on the face. And like I said, the right side would come naturally from a backhand. So those were all basically questioning your manhood. And the eye for an eye thing is, yeah, it's revenge. It's sitting there and saying, you know what, you done me this, and I'm going to do you that. That's not what self-defense is. Self-defense is, to me, is doing one's moral duty to another living human being that can't defend themselves at some point. So like I said, I don't condemn pacifists. That's their view. They're peaceful souls, I guess you'd call it. That's how they see the world, but I don't think they have any biblical right to condemn someone who believes in self-defense. And that to me is a biblical fact. And the moment you say that Jesus taught something different, then he changed the law. You can't have it both ways. Fulfilling the laws and changing the laws are two different things. And the mere fact, like I said, the disciples carried swords. Imagine Peter and Paul and all these guys walking around carrying AK-47s. That's what they were doing in their time. And when Peter strikes the man, he tells him, put your sword in its place. He doesn't say throw it away. He says put it in your place, because you're interfering with some biblical prophecy right now. That was the point. And yeah, if you're a violent man, I think you will die violently. But I don't think those things have anything to do with this. And I'll end on something that a little note from Earthlink I found and looking at all this. um, Actually, you know what? I do want to quote. There was one other passage I wanted to look at. Sorry, bear with me a second here, guys. But yeah, it's a complex subject in some ways, but you know, it's almost one of those things the Bible didn't speak about too much. Apparently, it seems. Unfortunately, in the New Testament, we don't, you know, it's not as clear. But I think it's not as clear because it's a given. There doesn't seem to be a definitive teaching saying that self-defense is off the table. Oh man, this computer. Come on. No, I guess maybe I just have to put this verse in the notes section here. I'll try it one more time, see if this will open up for me. There we go. Okay. Yeah, this is not gonna open up for me all the way. So anyway, I'll end with, like I said, these little closing thoughts that that I found on Earthlink about this particular subject in of itself. It says theologians at the end of it all, theologians J.P. Moreland and Norman Geisler say that to permit murder when one could have prevented it is morally wrong. To allow a rape when one could have hindered it is an evil. To watch an act of cruelty to children without trying to intervene is morally inexcusable. In brief, not resisting evil is an evil of omission, and an evil of omission can be just as evil as an evil of commission. Any man who refuses to protect his wife and children against a violent intruder fails them morally. And I have to say I kind of agree with that, you know. And like I said, if some brothers on here, and like I said, it's just my view. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm still, you know, I'm still thinking all this through. But I will say, if you're a brother that doesn't have children and a family, you really are in a different place on this issue. And I've spoken many times about wisdom. You know, wisdom is in gray areas. It's easy to be black and white if you don't have to think about your child, you know, looking at you years down the line and calling you a coward, basically. And justly so, rightfully so, in my opinion, you know, to watch them be harmed and do nothing about it. And, you know, my problem, like I said, with complete pacifism is that it's untenable in the world. It's like I said, you're talking no police. To me, you couldn't harm animals either. You know, realistically, you know, it's just, it would seem like a natural extension of being a pacifist. You wouldn't harm any animals because they were created by God too. You wouldn't have police. You wouldn't have any military. You know, a religion like Islam would just crush the known world in a matter of months. It would just absolutely crush it. You know, and for people living in, you know, places like the North America, United States, Canada, Mexico, you know, Britain, um, even Australia, I guess, and you know, in those terms, those places only exist because of their military might. I mean, there's some sad facts that need to be acknowledged. I don't see people renouncing their citizenship, and they like the comforts that strength brings. And I think even the country has the right to defend itself. And as we see clearly in Paul, the king, in our case it'd be the president, clearly has the right to bear the sword, and he's called a servant of God. I mean, it's end of discussion as far as what you think about violence and a king. Paul's very clear. He's sucking up to this guy, and he's saying he has every right to harm you. He is the vengeance of God. To have a leader come after you is to have the vengeance of God come after you, basically, is what he's getting at. So pay taxes and do all this other stuff. Well, in his time, the natural extension of that was, though all those countries were almost purely military facilities. I mean, there was no government without a military, and predominantly there weren't very many social services. The social service was the military. They provided protection along the roads. They provided protection against people getting murdered. That's what they did. That was their function. And Paul in no way speaks out against this. He does not. Now, like I said, if you're an evangelist, yeah, I would expect you to have a different view on what you personally do. But I just don't see where a pacifist does have the right, biblically speaking, to condemn a self-defense person, because you would have to eject the Old Testament, and look at all the killing that happened there. They were told to defend themselves. They were told to attack people. They were told, Moses killed all them people coming down off the mountain. So you can't say thou shalt not kill. That clearly cannot be what that means, because if that is what that means, then you have one of the biggest contradictions in the world right out the gate. But no, it means thou shalt not murder. It means to kill without edict. And I think that law, it's one of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not murder, is how it should read. That's how we would understand it. And Jesus didn't change the 10 commandments. You're not murdering to protect yourself. You're not murdering to protect your family. You're killing, yeah, absolutely. You would be killing in that situation, or if you got in a fist fight with somebody. To me, it's just not that big of a deal. Somebody snatches your wife's purse, and you get in a fist fight with them, and you get the purse back, and the guy runs off. I mean, really? You're going to say that's a sin? Are you going to say that's... I just don't see it personally. But we do know, like I said, I guess that's my biggest thing. I'm going to stop this now. Biblically speaking, I don't think there is a case to put an end to self-defense. Otherwise, Jesus did change the laws. He changed the 10 commandments. I think that's a fact. And I think Paul makes it plainly clear that violence committed by a king is what you deserve. If you don't pay taxes and you get it, and you get killed or you get beat, he's telling you that's the vengeance of God. That's the righteousness of God coming through that king. So Paul believed in violence, at least in some scenarios, right? Okay, we can nitpick, but you'd have to say the king bearing the sword, that's violence. And at least in some scenarios to Paul, violence was okay, and you may have deserved it because you violated the authority of God. So, and then, like I said, look at Jesus. He's going to usher in the world to come through violence. I mean, it's good people seem to have to resist bad people, And there are personal times and callings where that may be through nonviolence. You may walk and give up your life. But at other times, it seems that you have a duty to protect your family and fellow mankind. So that there's, that I could see both views being sustainable to a point. But ultimately sustaining out from that, I don't see how it's tenable. I mean, there's no more football, there's no more boxing, there's no... Everything you do right now would almost be, violence. All violence would be gone. You'd have a serious problem. You couldn't even discipline your children in a biblical manner. When it says spare the rod, spoil the child, it's speaking about one thing, weapons. And it means you couldn't even do that anymore. So I don't think that's what Jesus was saying, and I don't think Jesus changed the law. That's not what he was doing. And it seems to me, biblically speaking, that self-defense was just a given that flowed through the Bible. And yes, there may be circumstances where God calls you to lay down your life. That to me does not interfere with the normalized understanding of self-defense. So I don't know, just some thoughts on that. God bless.